Dawn breaks over Plattling, Bavaria on February 24, 1946, and American tanks roll into position surrounding wooden barracks, where 1,590 Russian men sleep unaware that this morning will bring their worst nightmare to life. These men aren't traditional prisoners of war, and they're certainly not criminals, just refugees who chose to fight Stalin while wearing German uniforms, and who surrendered to American forces, believing the United States would protect them from what they'd left behind. Colonel Thomas Gillies commanded the camp, and he'd given these men his personal promise, repeated it over and over until every Russian in those barracks believed it. Under no circumstances would they be sent back to the Soviet Union. Every man sleeping in those barracks had heard Gillies say it, trusted those words, built their hope around that guarantee. 6 a.m. brings soldiers pounding barracks doors with rifle butts while shouting orders in English that most Russians barely understand. And when the doors swing open, the men see tanks positioned outside, armed guards everywhere, and the truth hits them like cold water. They refuse to leave because these Russians know exactly what waits for them if American soldiers put them on trains heading east. Tear gas floods the barracks, forcing half-dazed men to stumble outside, coughing and choking, and American soldiers grab them one by one, drag them toward waiting trucks, beat anyone who resists with clubs until they stop fighting. Witnesses who survived describe scenes that haunted the American soldiers for decades, men loaded onto trucks like livestock, driven to rail yards, stuffed into boxcars, headed for the Soviet border. 5 men managed suicide during transport to the handover point, while 2 stabbed themselves with broken glass, and guards watched in frozen horror as prisoners bit through each other's jugular veins trying to bleed out rather than face what came next. General Andrei Vlasov's Russian Liberation Army gave these men their identity, former Red Army soldiers captured by Germans between 1941 and 1942 who faced an impossible choice and chose to fight against Stalin rather than die slowly in Nazi camps. May 1945 brought their finest hour when Czech resistance fighters in Prague begged for help and Vlasov's forces liberated the city from Nazi control while Western allies remained miles away, Russians wearing German uniforms freeing Czechoslovakia's capital from Hitler's grip. Surrender came immediately after Prague, the Russians believing Americans would surely protect soldiers who'd just battled Nazis. And 9 months later, American troops were forcing them at gunpoint onto trains, carrying them straight to Stalin's executioners. Why would American soldiers force refugees into a dictator's hands knowing he'd kill them? 18 months earlier, at a palace in Crimea, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed an agreement condemning more than 2 million people to death, and February 1945 at Yalta brought FDR cutting a deal with Stalin that remained secret from the American public for 30 years. All Soviet citizens in Western zones would go back to the USSR regardless of their wishes. The agreement stated in language as cold as the math behind it. Most never came back. Plattling wasn't some tragic mistake or isolated incident gone wrong, but one operation in a machinery of forced repatriations running across Europe from 1945 through 1947. American and British forces conducting operations that turned into scenes of mass suicide, desperate last stands, and violence traumatizing the soldiers ordered to carry out the policy. Operation Keelhaul fit the horror perfectly as a code name, taken from naval torture, where victims got tied to ropes and dragged under the ship's keel from one side to the other while barnacles on the hull shredded their bodies. Most victims died from wounds before reaching the other side. What happened to people sent back to Stalin proved worse than keelhauling. If declassified history like this interests you, hit subscribe because there's a lot more where this came from. Levadia Palace in Yalta, Crimea had served as the Tsar's summer residence before revolution swept the old order away, and February 1945 turned it into the stage for one of modern history's most consequential meetings. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin gathered to carve up the post-war world with Germany nearly beaten and Japan still fighting, and everyone at that table understood Stalin held the strongest hand because Red Army troops controlled Eastern Europe and nothing could change that reality. Historians have spent 80 years debating Yalta's public agreements, how Germany would be divided after defeat, how Poland would fall under Soviet control, when the USSR would enter the war against Japan 3 months after Germany surrendered, and how the United Nations would take shape. Newspapers reported these decisions, parliaments debated them, and the world watched as 3 men redrew the map. What nobody knew at the time started on February 11, 1945, when the conference's final day brought FDR signing another agreement that would stay buried in classified files for decades. Agreement relating to prisoners of war and civilians liberated by forces operating under Soviet command and forces operating under United States command ran the bureaucratic title, and Major General John R. Dean signed for America while Lieutenant General Gridlov signed for the Soviets. Brief language and straightforward terms hid catastrophic implications underneath. Western zones would return every Soviet citizen to the USSR, and Soviet citizen meant anyone living in Soviet-controlled territory on September 1, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. Millions fell under this single definition: prisoners of war, forced laborers the Nazis shipped to Germany, refugees fleeing communism, anyone trying to escape Stalin's regime, separated from enemy prisoners of war and maintained in camps until handed over to Soviet authorities appeared in cold bureaucratic phrasing, and the words without delay sealed their fate. Consent got no mention anywhere in the document, persecution fears received no protection, and the reality that some refugees had fled Stalin's terror decades before the Soviet Union existed didn't matter at all. FDR's own State Department had fought against this policy and fought hard, going back to December 1943, when Secretary of State Cordell Hull established clear American policy: no Russian POW could be returned by force. International law grounded the reasoning because anyone captured wearing a German uniform received Geneva Convention protection as a prisoner of war, and detaining powers couldn't look behind the uniform to determine citizenship or nationality questions. 3 days before Yalta opened on February 1, 1945, Acting Secretary of State Joseph Grew sent a memo laying out the legal argument in language nobody could misunderstand. Forcing these people back to the Soviet Union would violate the Geneva Convention, Grew argued, because the clear intention of the convention is that prisoners of war shall be treated on the basis of the uniforms they are wearing when captured. Aliens and even enemy country citizens served in the United States Army, Grew pointed out, and America had taken the official position that all these people deserved full Geneva Convention protection. More than a year earlier, the U.S. government had informed Germany that all prisoners entitled to repatriation under the convention should return to American custody regardless of nationality. Legal principle couldn't run clearer. If America demanded Germans return American soldiers regardless of citizenship papers, then America couldn't turn around and violate that principle by sending Russian soldiers back based on citizenship rather than the uniforms they wore. FDR read these arguments and ignored every single one. October 1944 brought Britain setting the precedent when Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden traveled to Moscow for talks with Stalin and Molotov, and Eden volunteered something that shocked even the Soviets: unconditional return of all Russian prisoners Britain held. Stalin hadn't asked for this yet, hadn't demanded anything, but Britain's foreign secretary offered it freely. Molotov pushed further, asking whether all Soviet citizens, regardless of their personal wishes, fell under the agreement, and Eden's response sealed millions of fates when he replied no objection. December 1944 saw Britain beginning forcible repatriation immediately, the first ship bound for Murmansk in the Soviet Arctic, and British liaison officers witnessing the handover filed reports describing rough treatment from Soviet authorities the moment prisoners transferred custody. Shoving, beating, prisoners marched away under armed guard, and then unmistakable automatic gunfire sounds coming from somewhere out of sight shortly after the Russians disappeared from view. Those reports reached the British Foreign Office, where they got read, filed, and ignored. November 8, 1944 marks when the United States agreed to shift policy toward forced repatriation, following the timeline as Cordell Hull resigned as Secretary of State and Edward Stettinius replaced him, while Joseph Grew became acting secretary. Grew's February 1st memo proves he opposed forced repatriation on legal grounds, standing against the policy shift. Yalta brought the moment of choice, and FDR sided with Churchill against his own State Department lawyers. Pressure from Churchill, combining with fear of angering Stalin and overwhelming desire to keep Stalin committed to joining the Pacific War. Stalin knew exactly what he asked for, because Order No. 270 issued in August 1941 after Germany's invasion had declared surrender equal to treason, punishable by death. Families of soldiers who surrendered faced arrest under the order, and throughout the war Stalin never wavered. Any Soviet soldier allowing himself to be captured alive had committed treason against the motherland. "Give me my traitors back," Stalin told FDR and Churchill in effect while sitting across that table, and both men knew what would happen because British officials had already witnessed Murmansk executions. They knew and signed anyway. 5. 2 million Soviet nationals had survived in German-occupied territory as prisoners of war, forced laborers, or refugees fleeing west ahead of advancing Red Army troops, when you count the full scope of who this agreement affected. Red Army soldiers captured by Germans numbered 2.4 million, civilian forced laborers kidnapped by Nazis and shipped to Germany as slaves reached 4.3 million, and an unknown number of white Russian migrants who fled the Bolshevik Revolution between 1918 and 1920 added to the total. Western Allied zones ended up holding about 2 million of these people, and FDR's signature on February 11, 1945, condemned them all. 2 months later, on April 12, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt died without ever seeing the full consequences of the deal he'd made. Harry Truman inherited both the policy and the choice. Soviet citizens, as a bureaucratic term, buried the human reality of who these people actually were, and their stories reveal why they fought so desperately against going back. Red Army prisoners of war captured during Germany's 1941 and 1942 invasion formed the largest category. And these weren't deserters or willing surrenderers, but soldiers trapped during massive encirclements when entire Soviet divisions got surrounded and cut off. Germany's invasion caught Stalin's forces completely unprepared despite numerous warnings, and military leadership that might have prevented these disasters had been gutted during Stalin's 1930s purges, when he executed thousands of experienced officers fearing they might challenge his power. Entire armies got encircled and captured in the invasion's opening months, approximately 3.3 million Soviet POWs falling into German hands by 1941's end. German treatment violated every standard of civilized warfare: no shelter, minimal food, disease running rampant through overcrowded camps, and roughly 60% of Soviet POWs dying in German captivity from starvation, exposure, disease, or summary execution. Survivors faced an impossible choice between dying slowly in camps or accepting German offers to become Hilfswillige, volunteer helpers working as cooks, drivers, laborers, and other support roles for the German military. Many took this option simply to survive, and some later joined combat units called Osttruppen, Eastern Troops, because even after becoming disillusioned with Hitler's brutal occupation policies, they believed German oppression represented the lesser of two evils compared to Stalin. General Andrei Vlasov embodied this impossible choice, and his story reveals the desperation driving Soviet soldiers into German service as a genuine Red Army hero who'd been awarded the Order of the Red Banner for successfully defending Moscow during the initial German onslaught in 1941. Germans captured him in July 1942 and recognized immediately they'd caught someone special. Defeating Stalin required working with Germans despite complete awareness of Nazi atrocities. Vlasov became convinced, and for 2 years he tried persuading Hitler to allow formation of a real Russian liberation army. Hitler refused because he didn't trust Russians and couldn't imagine they'd fight effectively, and only in 1944, when Germany was clearly losing, did Hitler finally relent. 2 divisions totaling approximately 50,000 men came together under Vlasov by then, too late to affect the war's outcome, and May 1945 brought these Russian soldiers in German uniforms, achieving something remarkable. Czech underground fighters in Prague begged for help liberating their city from Nazis, and Vlasov agreed, his forces freeing Prague while Western allies remained miles away. And immediately after this success, Vlasov's army surrendered to American forces, believing they'd be treated as allies who'd just fought against Nazis. Traditional warrior culture from southern Russia gave Cossacks their distinct identity, brutally suppressed by Stalin during the 1920s and 1930s, as entire Cossack villages got deported to Kazakhstan during collectivization, while hundreds of thousands died for resisting Soviet policies. Germany's 1941 invasion gave many Cossacks a chance to fight back against the regime that had destroyed their communities. Formation of the 15th SS Cossack Cavalry Corps followed, fighting against Tito's communist partisans in Yugoslavia. and Germany's May 1945 collapse sent approximately 40,000 Cossacks, including soldiers, wives, children, and elderly, retreating into Austria. British forces accepted their surrender. The Cossacks, believing Britain, which had allied with White Russian forces during the Civil War, would surely protect them from Stalin. White Russian migrants who'd never lived a single day under Soviet rule numbered among those surrendering, having fled during or after the 1918-1920 Russian Civil War. General Pyotr Krasnov stood 71 years old in 1945, having led White armies allied with Britain and France against Bolsheviks, and when Whites lost, British and French warships evacuated him along with thousands of others who spent the next 25 years living in exile throughout Europe. General Andrei Shkuro shared similar background as another White Russian leader who fought alongside the British, fled in 1920, and never held Soviet citizenship. Both men ended up in Austria with Cossack refugees in 1945, holding League of Nations Nansen passports, designating them as stateless persons. And according to international law and even official British Foreign Office policy statements issued after Yalta, these men weren't Soviet citizens and shouldn't face forcible repatriation. British Army handed them over anyway. Ostarbeiter, Eastern workers that Nazis kidnapped from occupied Soviet territories, formed the largest category numerically, as more than 4 million Soviet civilians got forcibly transported to Germany for slave labor in factories and on farms. Genuine victims of Nazi aggression included grandparents, mothers, teenagers, anyone Germans could round up and ship west. Allied armies advancing across Germany in 1945 liberated these civilians from forced labor, and they found themselves in Western occupation zones, many terrified at the prospect of returning to the USSR. Stalin's paranoia ran deep in their knowledge, his view that any Western contact constituted contamination, and fears they'd be treated as traitors despite being victims. Reality twisted into nightmare through Stalin's logic. Being captured equaled treason because you should have fought to death. Working for Germans equaled collaboration regardless of circumstances, and exposure to Western ideas equaled ideological contamination, making you dangerous to the Soviet state. Absolute certainty that returning to Stalin's USSR meant death or Gulag connected everyone from Vlasov soldiers to Cossacks to white migrants to civilian forced laborers. Paranoia didn't drive this belief and exaggeration didn't inflate it, because Stalin's Order 270 from August 1941 had spelled out his position brutally clear, and everything they knew about Stalin's regime told them mercy wasn't an option. FDR's Yalta signature requiring their return, regardless of their wishes, meant they were being handed a death sentence. And they knew it. May 8, 1945 brought Germany's unconditional surrender, and suddenly Western allies held approximately 2 million people that Stalin demanded back immediately, and Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, controlled by General Eisenhower, moved quickly to comply with Yalta's terms. Between May and September 1945, SHAEF delivered 2,034,000 people to Soviet authorities. 2 million people in 5 months works out to more than 13,000 people per day. Every single day for 5 straight months, and SHAEF reported during peak operations they were processing more than 30,000 Soviet citizens daily. Trains running constantly, trucks and convoys, ships crossing the Baltic, all moving human cargo eastward towards Soviet zones in logistics that staggered the imagination. Relative smoothness characterized early repatriations because immediate post-war chaos meant many Soviet prisoners actually wanted to return home, not knowing about Stalin's Order 270, not understanding captured soldiers would be treated as traitors, and believing they'd be welcomed back as Nazi, aggression victims who'd survived terrible ordeals. Arrival at the Soviet border revealed the truth. British liaison officers stationed at Murmansk in December 1944 witnessed first handovers and filed reports that should have stopped the entire operation cold. Soviet authorities administered rough treatment from the transfer moment, shoving and beating returning prisoners, marching them away under armed guard, and British officers heard automatic gunfire coming from somewhere out of sight shortly after prisoners disappeared from view. Unmistakable sound with clear implication reached the British Foreign Office in London, where reports got read, filed, and ignored, because policy had already been decided at the highest levels and field reports from junior officers weren't going to change Churchill's commitment to Stalin. Displaced persons camps in Western zones started receiving word of what happened at Soviet borders through family letters, through Soviet citizens who managed escaping and making their way back west, and through the simple fact that none of the repatriates were ever heard from again. Summer 1945 brought understanding to Soviet citizens being held in Western camps. FDR's February agreement was a death sentence. Resistance began. June 29, 1945 brought an incident on American soil revealing just how desperately these people would fight to avoid going back, when Fort Dix, New Jersey held 154 Soviet citizens who'd been captured wearing German uniforms during the June 1944 D-Day Normandy invasion. Transport to the United States and holding as prisoners of war came with explicit promises from U.S. military authorities. Under no circumstances would they be repatriated to the Soviet Union. Those promises were real, and the men believed them. And that's when June 29th arrived, bringing news they were being sent back in accordance with an agreement reached at the Yalta Conference for the reciprocal exchange of Soviet and United States citizens. Barricading themselves in barracks and setting small fires brought the men's response, and when military police arrived, the prisoners refused coming out. Tear gas pumped into the building forced half-dazed men outside, where they charged guards armed with mess kit knives and clubs made from broken furniture, and violence erupted with 2 American officers wounded, 1 private injured, and 7 Russian prisoners shot. Guards finally entering the barracks found a scene haunting them for the rest of their lives. 3 men hanging from rafters having chosen suicide over Stalin. Lieutenant Feokist Kalinin, Lieutenant Ignats Nasarenko, and Private Philip Spato had hanged themselves, and 15 other nooses hung unused from the ceiling because guards had interrupted the mass suicide before completion. Finns Point National Cemetery in New Jersey holds these 3 men's graves still today. 3 white headstones all bearing the same date of June 29th, 1945. Marking the day they chose death over going home. Public outcry over Fort Dix forced President Truman granting a temporary reprieve, but Acting Secretary of State Joseph Grew signed an order on July 11, 1945, stating these men would go back anyway because Soviet cooperation would prove necessary to remake post-war Europe. Same calculation FDR had made at Yalta, same choice to sacrifice Russians maintaining the Stalin alliance. September 6, 1945 brought the final attempt at repatriating Fort Dix prisoners after 7 got determined to not actually be Soviet citizens and were released, and the remaining 147 were told to board a Soviet ship where they fought back with bare hands. Fighting turned into riot. Prisoners began systematically destroying the ship's engines, making the vessel unseaworthy so it couldn't sail them to their deaths. Repatriation attempt failed, and prisoners returned to Fort Dix, but American authorities weren't giving up. A sergeant came up with the solution: barbiturates mixed into prisoners' coffee at breakfast, and soon all 147 men fell into deep coma like sleep. Unconscious loading onto another Soviet vessel followed. Transport to Germany, handover to Soviet authorities. None of them were ever heard from again. News about these incidents was leaking out to American public by this time, causing indignation among those who heard, and already troops carrying out forced repatriations were becoming disgusted with their orders. Some began resisting or evading directives, and in Europe scenes were becoming even worse because Russians there knew what was coming, and their resistance was getting fiercer and more desperate. Carnage scenes with American and British soldiers shocked and horrified at what they were being ordered to do became the new normal, and the worst was yet to come. Austria in May 1945 filled with refugees streaming west ahead of advancing Red Army, and British Fifth Corps found itself accepting surrender of approximately 50,000 Cossacks, including soldiers from the 15th SS Cossack Cavalry Corps along with their families and civilian refugees fleeing Yugoslav. Communist partisans. British officers set up camps near the towns of Lienz, Pegetz, and in the Drau Valley, repeatedly assuring Cossacks they were safe under British protection. Cossacks wanted to believe this because Britain had allied with White Russian forces during the 1918-1920 Civil War, and surely the British would remember those old alliances and protect people who'd fought against communism. May 28, 1945 brought British officers issuing orders that all Cossack officials should attend an important conference with higher British authorities and Cossacks were told to leave their coats behind because they'd be back by 6 in the evening, while families got advised not to worry because this would be a short absence. Morning came and 2,749 Cossacks boarded British trucks, including 2,201 officers, among them General Pyotr Krasnov, who was 71 years old and had led white armies allied with British during the Civil War, and General Andrei Shuro, who shared the same background. Both men had left Russia 25 years earlier and had never been Soviet citizens, holding League of Nations Nansen passports, designating them as stateless refugees. Nervousness appeared among Cossacks about boarding the trucks, and that's when an English officer stepped forward, giving formal assurance using words that would become infamous. "I assure you on my word of honor as a British officer that you are just going to a conference." Complete and deliberate lie. Trucks drove straight to a prison camp surrounded by armed guards, and British officers informed Cossacks that Soviet authorities were coming to collect them for repatriation to the USSR. Realization hit like a physical blow because these men understood instantly what had happened. Betrayal and British word of honor meant nothing. One Cossack officer captured the bitter reality in words that got recorded and later quoted by historians. "The NKVD or the Gestapo would have slain us with truncheons. British did it with their word of honor." First suicide came quickly when Evgenij Tarusky, a Cossack newspaper editor, hanged himself that same day, and others began following his example because death by their own hand was preferable to what awaited in Soviet custody. June 1st and 2nd, 1945 brought British attempting to load remaining Cossacks onto trains for transport to the Soviet zone. And this included approximately 30 to 40,000 people counting families, civilians, women, children, and elderly. Cossacks formed human chains by linking arms and refused to separate, and British soldiers got ordered to break them apart by force. Peget's camp on June 1st saw approximately 4,000 Cossacks gather for morning mass and link arms during the service, and British soldiers waded into the crowd using rifle butts, bayonets, and clubs to separate them. 4 hours of violence continued with witnesses reporting British soldiers ripping babies from mothers' arms, and the fence around camp collapsed from the crush of people trying to escape, while 1,252 eventually got forced onto trains. That single day at Peget's brought more than 130 suicides. Women administering morphine to their children and then to themselves, men slitting their own throats, people jumping from bridges, hanging themselves with whatever rope or cloth they could find. One witness recorded Cossacks shouting that their blood was on British hands as they died. Trauma hit British soldiers from what they were being ordered to do. And many would later describe these operations as the worst experiences of their entire military service despite having fought through the war against Nazi Germany. Drow Valley saw approximately 200 Caucasians form a defensive circle and link arms, refusing to separate, and British soldiers used entrenching tools, basically small shovels, to beat them into submission before forcing them onto trucks at gunpoint. Among those British handed over to Soviet authorities were General Pyotr Krasnov and General Andrei Shuro, both men who'd fought alongside Britain against Bolsheviks, both men who'd fled Russia 25 years earlier, both men who'd never been Soviet citizens and who held internationally recognized. Refugee documents. Official British Foreign Office policy statement issued after Yalta had specified clearly only Soviet citizens who had been such after September 1st, 1939 were to be compelled to return to the Soviet Union. Krasnov and Shuro didn't qualify under this definition, and neither did thousands of other White Russian migrants, but British Army on the ground ignored policy and handed them all over anyway. Trains carrying these people arrived at Soviet zone where NKVD officers took custody, and prisoners disappeared into the Soviet system. January 16, 1947, brought Krasnov and Shuro to public executions in Moscow where they were hanged, and thousands of others faced summary execution or got sent to the Gulag system where most died within a few years. Systematic family separation followed with men sent to labor camps, women to different camps, and children placed in orphanages where they got raised as children of traitors given new identities and told their parents were dead. British Field Marshal Harold Alexander, who commanded Allied forces in southern Europe and held responsibility for Lien's operations, ordered his own investigation after reports of what had happened reached him. Investigation discovered British officers had violated British government policy by handing over people who weren't Soviet citizens, and Alexander protested to his superiors in London. Protests got ignored, and he received orders to continue repatriations, but Alexander began dragging his feet and introducing bureaucratic delays that allowed some people to escape. Cover-up began immediately, with files being classified, and the full truth wouldn't emerge for 3 decades. Lien's operations became known among historians as one of the darkest chapters in British military history, a betrayal violating both international law and Britain's own stated policies, and it was all done to maintain the alliance with Stalin. Understanding why Franklin Roosevelt signed the forced repatriation agreement requires looking at the situation he faced in February 1945. And the picture reveals a leader making cold calculations about whose lives mattered more. Red Army was liberating German prisoner of war camps across Eastern Europe as it advanced westward, and approximately 75,000 American POWs were in camps the Soviets would reach, along with about 40,000 British prisoners. Stalin controlled access to these men, and reports were already coming back that Soviets weren't releasing Western prisoners quickly or treating them well. American and British POWs liberated by Soviet forces were being stripped of possessions, forced to walk hundreds of miles to collection points, and held for weeks or months before being turned over to Western authorities in some cases. Stalin was using them as leverage and FDR knew it, and the nightmare scenario keeping Roosevelt awake ran simple. What if Stalin refused releasing American POWs unless the West sent back all Soviet citizens? 75,000 Americans versus approximately 2 million Russians came down to FDR's calculation, and for Roosevelt the choice wasn't even close, because his job meant protecting American lives, not Russian lives. Getting American boys home at the cost of sending 2 million Russians back to Stalin's executioners was a price FDR was willing to pay. Alternatives that FDR chose not to pursue existed, though. Joseph Grew's February 1, 1945 memo had laid out the legal argument grounded in Geneva Convention. Prisoners captured wearing German uniforms got protected as German POWs regardless of actual citizenship, and detaining powers couldn't look behind the uniform to determine nationality. December 1943 brought Secretary of State Cordell Hull establishing this as official United States policy, when he stated explicitly no Russian POW could be returned by force. American military lawyers stood unanimous in their assessment that forced repatriation violated international law, violated the Geneva Convention, and contradicted America's own stated principles. FDR had all this legal advice in front of him when he went to Yalta, read it, understood it, and signed the agreement anyway. British had already established a precedent by beginning forced repatriations in October 1944, 4 months before Yalta, when Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden traveled to Moscow and offered Stalin unconditional return of all Russian POWs. Stalin had been surprised because he hadn't even demanded this yet, but Molotov pushed further, asking whether the agreement should include all Soviet citizens regardless of their personal wishes, and Eden's no objection response set the policy. Britain's first repatriation ship departed for Murmansk in December 1944, and British liaison officers witnessed what happened when prisoners got handed over: rough treatment, beatings, armed guards marching prisoners away, and then automatic gunfire coming from somewhere out of sight. These reports made it back to Foreign Office, where they got filed and ignored because Churchill had already decided maintaining the Stalin alliance took priority over Russian prisoners' lives. FDR followed Churchill's lead because pressure to stay aligned with Britain ran immense, because angering Stalin risked the Soviet commitment to join war against Japan, and because FDR believed he needed Stalin's cooperation to build post-war order, including the United Nations. Stalin's strategy in all this reveals something about what FDR knew when he signed the agreement, though. Stalin's Order No. 270 from August 1941 had declared surrender equal to treason punishable by death, that families of soldiers who surrendered would be arrested, and that any Soviet prisoner of war was a traitor to the motherland. This wasn't some secret order hidden in classified files, but a public decree that had been broadcast throughout the Soviet Union. Stalin sat across the table from FDR and Churchill at Yalta, essentially saying, "Give me my traitors back so I can execute them," and both Western leaders understood exactly what he meant. British officials had already witnessed executions at Murmansk, reports were in the files, and no ambiguity existed about what would happen to repatriated Soviet citizens. FDR knew and signed anyway because his calculation ran simple. American lives mattered more than Russian lives. Maintaining the Stalin alliance mattered more than upholding international law. And winning the war against Japan mattered more than protecting refugees from Stalin's executioners. Approximately 27 Russians condemned to death for every single American POW that FDR wanted to get home works out the math. And Franklin Roosevelt made that trade without hesitation. April 12, 1945 brought FDR's death just 2 months after signing the Yalta Agreement, and he never witnessed the full consequences of his decision. Harry Truman inherited the policy and inherited the choice, and Truman's actions at Fort Dix revealed he made the same calculation as FDR. Temporary reprieve followed the June 29th riot and 3 suicides, but July 11th brought Acting Secretary of State Joseph Grew signing the order sending prisoners back with justification that Soviet cooperation would prove necessary to remake post-war Europe. Same logic, same choice, same willingness to sacrifice Russian lives maintaining the relationship with Stalin. Whether there really were no alternatives haunts this history is a question. France proved refusing was possible because France hadn't been at Yalta, and French commanders in their occupation zone refused participating in forced repatriations, protecting thousands of refugees who made it to French-controlled areas. Tiny Liechtenstein, with total population of 13,000 people and no army, told Stalin no when he demanded return of 500 Russians who'd taken refuge there, and if Liechtenstein could stand up to Stalin, why couldn't the United States? Answer reveals something uncomfortable about FDR's decision. Protecting these people wasn't impossible, but protecting them wasn't worth the diplomatic cost Roosevelt was willing to pay. Yalta Agreement represented FDR choosing to sacrifice 2 million people, not because there was absolutely no alternative, but because alternatives would have required challenging Stalin, risking the alliance, and accepting that some American POWs might be held longer or face rougher treatment. Franklin Roosevelt made a choice, a deliberate, calculated choice, and 2 million people paid for it with their lives. Summer 1945 brought resistance not just from victims, but from American and British soldiers being ordered to carry out forced repatriations. And as these men witnessed the horrors they were being asked to inflict, some began refusing because they hadn't fought against Nazis for 4 years just to become instruments of Stalin's terror. General George Patton commanded U.S. Third Army in Germany and received orders in June 1945 to repatriate 5,000 Soviet prisoners of war being held in his zone. Patton had visited Nazi concentration camps and seen firsthand what industrial-scale murder looked like, and now he was being told to send people to the Soviet equivalent of those death camps. June 1945 brought Patton's response. He simply released all 5,000 Russians, telling them to disappear and find new identities, and some reports suggest he provided false papers to help them escape. Direct violation of Yalta Agreement, direct disobedience of orders from SHAEF headquarters, and Patton didn't care because his conscience wouldn't allow him to send people to their deaths. Eisenhower was furious when he learned what Patton had done, but by then the Russians had scattered, and tracking them down was impossible. Patton never apologized and never expressed regret, and in typical blunt style he made clear he considered forced repatriation policy to be morally wrong regardless of what agreements had been signed at Yalta. British Field Marshal Harold Alexander faced a different situation commanding Allied forces in southern Europe where Lien's operations fell under his authority, and after the June 1st and 2nd massacres when more than 130 Cossacks committed suicide in a single day, and British soldiers were traumatized by what they'd been ordered to do. Alexander ordered an investigation. Investigation revealed something that should have stopped the entire operation immediately. British officers had violated British government policy by handing over people who were demonstrably not Soviet citizens. Foreign Office statement issued after Yalta had been clear that only Soviet citizens who had been such after September 1st, 1939 were subject to forced repatriation, and generals like Krasnov and Shkuro, along with thousands of white Russian migrants, didn't meet that definition. Alexander protested to his superiors in London, presenting evidence that British Army units had violated policy, but response from London ran simple: continue the repatriations anyway. Alexander couldn't disobey direct orders, but he could drag his feet, and he began introducing bureaucratic delays, demanding additional paperwork, and slowing the process enough that some people managed escaping during the delays. August 12, 1945 brought an incident at Fort Kempton in Germany, revealing how widespread resistance among ordinary soldiers had become when 410 Soviet displaced persons were hiding in a church refusing to come out, and American soldiers got ordered to extract them by force. Troops entered the church and hand-to-hand fighting erupted with soldiers using rifle butts and fists, and when melee ended, 12 people were wounded with 2 seriously injured. 90 of the 410 managed escaping in the confusion, though, and multiple witnesses later reported American guards had deliberately looked the other way, allowing people to run. Official reports blamed the chaos of fighting for the escapes, but soldiers involved knew the truth. They had let those people go because forcing them back to Stalin felt wrong. Fall 1945 brought resistance from troops carrying out repatriations becoming serious enough that both Eisenhower and British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery felt compelled to act. Eisenhower cabled Washington asking for policy clarification because his soldiers were becoming increasingly unwilling to use force, and Montgomery sent similar requests to London. Both commanders ordered temporary halt to forced repatriations while awaiting guidance from their governments, and this pause in fall 1945 saved some lives as operations slowed down. Resulting directive that came back from Washington and London became known as McNarney-Clark Directive, after General Joseph McNarney, who had succeeded Eisenhower and British General Mark Clark. November 1945 brought the directive significantly narrowing criteria for forced repatriation by specifying that only those who both wore German uniforms and actively aided the German war effort would be sent back. Simply being captured wasn't enough anymore, because there had to be evidence of actual collaboration with Nazis. Major policy shift and partial victory for soldiers who'd been protesting the policy followed, but timing revealed bitter truth. Most people who fit even the narrower criteria had already been repatriated during massive May through September operations. McNarney-Clark Directive was closing the barn door after horses had already escaped, or in this case, after they'd already been shipped to their deaths. Soldiers who participated in forced repatriation operations and later spoke about their experiences described trauma that stayed with them for decades. American screening officer Genghis Gwairi left written account capturing the psychological toll. The most unpleasant aspect of this unpleasant business was the fear these people displayed. Involuntarily, one began to look over one's shoulder. I heard so many threats to commit suicide from people who feared repatriation that it became almost commonplace. And they were not fooling. British soldier who participated in Yugoslav repatriation operations wrote anonymously 50 years later, and his words reveal the weight these men carried. We were told not to use force and forbidden to inform them of their true destination. When they asked us where they were going, we replied that we were transferring them to another British camp in Italy, and they mounted the trains without suspicion. As soon as sliding doors of cattle trucks were padlocked, our soldiers withdrew and Tito's partisans emerged from the station building where they had been hiding. British soldier continued. Prisoners and refugees could see them through cracks in the boarding and began hammering on in sides of wagons, shouting abuse at us for having betrayed them, lied to them, and sentenced at least the men among them to a grotesque death. 50 years later, I can still hear them. Men who'd fought bravely against Nazis, who'd survived Normandy and Market Garden and Battle of the Bulge, described forced repatriation operations as worse than combat, because in combat you faced an armed enemy trying to kill you, but in forced repatriation you were dragging terrified refugees to their deaths and watching them commit suicide rather than go with you. Resistance from soldiers created enough problems that policy eventually changed, but for approximately 2 million people, the change came too late because they'd already been handed over to Stalin's executioners during the first mad rush of May through September 1945. Trains and trucks carrying repatriated Soviet citizens arrived at designated handover points along the border between Western and Soviet zones, and NKVD officers were always waiting with armed guards, no welcome committees, no relief organizations, just immediate custody transfer from Western. Allied soldiers to Stalin's secret police. Filtration camps received every single repatriate interrogation facilities where prisoners got held for weeks or months while being questioned about every aspect of their time in German-controlled territory. Questions came in the same pattern for everyone. How were you captured? What did you do during captivity? Did you collaborate with Germans? Who did you meet from the West? What did they tell you about the Soviet Union? Default assumption built into the entire filtration process ran that everyone was compromised by Western contact. Everyone was guilty until proven innocent, and proving innocence was nearly impossible. Stalin's paranoia had reached levels where even being a victim of Nazi aggression didn't matter, because you'd been exposed to foreigners and foreign ideas, which made you dangerous to the Soviet state. Reality twisted into nightmare through Stalin's logic, where facts of what actually happened didn't matter. Being captured meant you should have fought to death instead of surrendering. Working as forced labor for Germans meant you'd collaborated regardless of whether you had any choice. And being exposed to Western ideas meant you were contaminated with capitalist thinking that threatened communist ideology. Filtration camp verdicts sorted people into three main categories, and each category led to a different form of death or living hell. Category 1 meant immediate execution and applied to anyone who'd actively fought against Soviet forces. Officers in Vlasov's army faced summary execution. Cossack military leaders got executed. And anyone identified as having worn a German uniform and fired a weapon at Soviet troops was shot. 500,000 to 750,000 people got executed either immediately upon arrival at border or after brief show trials in Moscow, according to estimates. Moscow on August 1, 1946 brought General Andrei Vlasov being hanged along with 11 other leaders of Russian Liberation Army, and their execution got publicized as a warning to anyone who might consider opposing Stalin. January 16, 1947 brought public hangings for Generals Pyotr Krasnov and Andrei Shkuro, the two white Russian migrants who'd never been Soviet citizens but whom British had handed over anyway. Executions weren't quick or merciful, but were deliberately staged as spectacles of state vengeance, and witnesses described condemned men being paraded before crowds and denounced as traitors before being hanged. Their bodies were left hanging for hours as a message. Category 2 covered the majority of repatriates who got sent to Gulag labor camp system, and 280,000 people were documented as entering Gulag system directly from filtration camps, though actual number was almost certainly higher. Sentences typically ran for 25 years of hard labor in camps scattered across Siberia, Kazakhstan, and Soviet far north, and work was deliberately designed to be brutal, mining in conditions where temperatures reached 50 degrees below zero, logging in forests where men worked 12-hour shifts with, minimal food, and construction projects where prisoners got treated as disposable labor. Survival rates in Gulag averaged around 30%, meaning most people sent there died within 5 years from disease, malnutrition, exhaustion, or brutal conditions. 25-year sentence was effectively a death sentence since very few prisoners survived long enough to complete their terms. Category 3 consisted of special settlements or internal exile where families got sent to remote villages in Kazakhstan or Siberia and told they'd live there permanently. These weren't prisoners in camps, but they weren't free either, because movement was restricted, they lived under constant surveillance by local NKVD officers, and conditions in these remote settlements were harsh enough that many died from exposure, disease, or starvation during first few winters. Systematic destruction of families represented one of the cruelest aspects of Soviet repatriation system because women got separated from husbands, children were taken from parents and sent to state orphanages, and families were deliberately split up so they could never reunite. Children of repatriated parents got raised as children of traitors and given new identities while being told their parents were dead, and many of these children grew up never knowing who their real families were. Women sent to labor camps were kept completely separate from men, so husbands and wives who'd survived the war together and endured forced repatriation together got torn apart at filtration camps and sent to different parts of Gulag system. Most died never knowing whether their spouse was alive or dead. Khrushchev thaw of the 1950s brought first glimmer of hope when Stalin died on March 5, 1953, and Nikita Khrushchev eventually emerged as new Soviet leader. 1956 brought Khrushchev announcing limited amnesty, releasing hundreds of thousands of prisoners from Gulag system, and some repatriated Soviet citizens were among those released, though not all. Vlasov's soldiers and Cossack fighters remained classified as traitors, and many stayed in camps until they died. But civilian forced laborers and some Red Army POWs got released after serving 10 or 15 years. These survivors returned to their families as broken men and women, sick from years of hard labor, traumatized by what they'd endured, and still stigmatized as enemies of the people even though they'd supposedly been forgiven. Soviet newspaper editorial from 1956 addressing released prisoners captured the twisted logic perfectly. All their sins have been forgiven. Sins being forgiven were being captured by Germans, being forced laborers trying to survive and having Western contact. These were their sins. Small number of people managed escaping repatriation entirely through luck, courage, or help from sympathetic Allied soldiers. Some hid in forests for months or years, surviving on whatever they could find, and slowly making their way west into zones where repatriation wasn't being enforced. Others received false identity papers from Allied soldiers who deliberately looked the other way, and these people disappeared into post-war Europe's chaos, adopting new names and new identities. French occupation zone in Austria became a refuge because France hadn't participated in Yalta Conference, and French commanders simply refused participating in forced repatriation. Thousands of Soviet citizens made it to French-controlled areas where they got allowed to remain as displaced persons, and France faced complaints and pressure from Stalin, but French stood firm. Liechtenstein provided the most remarkable example of resistance to Stalin's demands when approximately 500 Russian soldiers who'd been fighting in German uniforms crossed into Liechtenstein territory at war's end and requested asylum. Liechtenstein was a tiny principality with total population of about 13,000 people, most of them farmers, no army, and a police force of 11 officers. Stalin demanded these soldiers be handed over and threatened consequences if Liechtenstein refused. But Prince Franz Joseph II made the decision that his country would not participate in sending people to their deaths. Liechtenstein told Stalin no and faced him down despite having no military power whatsoever, and all 500 Russians got protected and eventually resettled in other countries. If a nation of 13,000 people could stand up to Stalin and refuse forced repatriation, it raises the obvious question of why United States and Britain, with all their military and economic power, chose not to do the same. An answer reveals it wasn't about capability, but about will. FDR and Churchill decided maintaining the Stalin alliance was more important than protecting these people, and they had the power to make that decision stick. For the 2 million who got sent back, protection came too late, or never came at all, and most of them died in execution chambers, in Gulag labor camps, or in remote settlements where cold and hunger and despair eventually killed them. American and British governments moved quickly to classify everything related to forced repatriation operations because they understood public knowledge of what had been done would create outrage that could threaten both FDR and Churchill's reputations. September 18, 1948 brought U.S. Army formally classifying 3 volumes of reports under the title Forcible Repatriation of Displaced Soviet Citizens Operation Keelhaul, with designation Top Secret and file number 383.714.1. Archives buried these documents with access denied to researchers, historians, journalists, and even members of Congress who might ask uncomfortable questions. Internal government memos documented the reasoning behind secrecy. American and British public would be outraged if they knew their soldiers had been ordered to force refugees back to Stalin at gunpoint, that forced repatriation violated the Geneva Convention that Allies had accused Nazis of. Violating, and that scenes of mass suicide and desperate resistance had been routine during these operations. Public opinion was already starting to turn against Soviet Union as Cold War began taking shape, and revealing Western governments had been complicit in sending 2 million people to their deaths in Stalin's camps would undermine the moral authority America and Britain were claiming in there. Confrontation with Soviet communism. Better to bury the evidence and pretend it never happened. Press releases issued to public during and after repatriation operations emphasized the word voluntary and claimed Soviet citizens were anxious to return home and were being repatriated at their own request. No mention appeared anywhere of force, of suicides, of barbiturates being mixed into coffee, of rifle butts and bayonets being used on refugees, or of desperate resistance that characterized almost every repatriation operation after summer 1945. Staged scenes of smiling repatriates waving from trains got photographed, and these images were distributed widely to newspapers, creating the impression everyone was happy going home. Reality of cattle cars filled with people who'd tried committing suicide rather than board those trains got carefully hidden. Fort Dix incident provides clearest example of cover-up in action because June 29, 1945 brought 3 men hanging themselves, and the story made local newspapers before military censors could suppress it. Historian Julius Epstein began trying to access Army records about the incident in July 1945, just days after it happened, and Army initially told him no such records existed. Years of persistence brought Epstein demanding access under various legal provisions, and finally receiving a letter from Department of Army, Office of Chief of Information and Education, stating that the records you requested permission to see are part of a group of documents determined by A. Recent study is requiring indefinite maintenance of their current high-security classification. Indefinite maintenance meant forever, meaning these records would never be released to public, but Epstein found an ally in Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, who helped him get some Fort Dix documents declassified in 1955. Even then, only partial records got released, and full story remained hidden. Through the 1950s and early 1960s, forced repatriation remained one of World War II's best-kept secrets, with most Americans and British citizens having no idea it had even happened. Few people who knew about it either had participated and were bound by classification restrictions, or had lost family members and had no platform to tell their stories. Late 1960s brought slow leak of information beginning when Cold War was firmly established, and declassifying some documents about Soviet atrocities served American propaganda purposes. 1967 brought major declassification of Operation Keelhaul files, and researchers finally gained access to official documents confirming the scale and brutality of forced repatriation operations. Academic historians began studying newly available documents, and truth started emerging in scholarly publications. But it took books aimed at general audiences to bring the story to wide public attention. 1973 brought Julius Epstein publishing Operation Keelhaul, the story of forced repatriation from 1944 to the present, first comprehensive account based on declassified U.S. documents, and Epstein's meticulous research proved forced repatriation had been official policy, had been carried out systematically, and had resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths. 1974 brought British historian Lord Bethell publishing The Last Secret, focused on British involvement in forced repatriation, particularly Lienz operations, and BBC produced a documentary based on Bethell's book that same year. British public reaction ran shock and anger because most people had no idea British soldiers had been ordered to hand over refugees to Stalin, and documentary sparked intense debate about Churchill's wartime decisions. 1977 brought Nikolai Tolstoy, British historian of Russian descent, publishing Victims of Yalta, which became the most detailed and comprehensive account of forced repatriation using both American and British archives. Tolstoy's research documented specific operations, named officers who'd carried out policy, and provided extensive testimony from survivors and from Allied soldiers who'd participated. Tolstoy's book publication triggered a legal battle lasting more than a decade when Lord Aldington, British officer who'd been involved in Lienz operations, sued Tolstoy for libel over war crimes accusations. Case went to trial in 1989, and court proceedings brought extensive evidence about forced repatriation into public record, even though Tolstoy ultimately lost the case and got ordered to pay damages. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Nobel Prize-winning author who'd survived Stalin's Gulag and written the Gulag Archipelago exposing the Soviet prison camp system, called Operation Keelhaul the last secret of World War II. Solzhenitsyn contributed to Tolstoy's legal defense fund and brought international attention to the issue, arguing forced repatriation represented a moral crime the West had tried to bury. 1990s and 2000s brought full archival access as more documents got declassified and historians could finally piece together the complete story. Consensus that emerged from this research confirmed the scale of what had happened. Between 5 million people were forcibly repatriated to Soviet Union between 1945 and 1947, and death estimates range from 500,000 to potentially over 1 million when counting both immediate executions and deaths in Gulag system. Modern legal and historical assessments conclude forced repatriation violated Geneva Convention as it existed in 1945, violated the principle of political asylum that had been recognized in international law, and qualified as refoulement, the forced return of people to places where they face persecution. 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights and 1951 Refugee Convention, both codified principles designed specifically to prevent another Operation Keelhaul from ever happening. Legal legacy of forced repatriation changed international law permanently because principle of non-refoulement became fundamental to refugee protection, and today, returning refugees to countries where they face persecution is recognized as violating international law precisely because of what happened in 1945-1947. But for 2 million people, these legal protections came too late because they'd already been handed over to Stalin's executioners under an agreement signed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt at Yalta. February 11, 1945 brought Franklin Delano Roosevelt sitting in Levadia Palace at Yalta and signing an agreement that would condemn more than 2 million people to death, or Gulag. And the question that has haunted historians for 8 decades asks whether FDR understood what he was doing. Answer is yes, he knew. Roosevelt knew Stalin's reputation from the 1930s show trials and purges when Stalin murdered millions of his own people, knew about Stalin's Order 270 from August 1941 declaring surrender equal to treason punishable by death, and knew that families of captured Soviet soldiers were being arrested. British officials had witnessed executions at Murmansk in December 1944, when first repatriation ship arrived, and reports of automatic gunfire after prisoners were handed over had made it into the files. Joseph Grew's February 1, 1945 memo had laid out in clear legal language why forced repatriation violated Geneva Convention, and State Department lawyers stood unanimous that policy contradicted international law and American principles. FDR had all this information in front of him when he went to Yalta, read it, understood it, and signed the agreement anyway. What FDR chose ran as cold calculation: 75,000 American prisoners of war versus 2 million Russians, Americans versus foreigners, our boys versus Stalin's victims. Approximately 27 Russians condemned to death for every single American that FDR wanted to bring home works out the math, and Franklin Roosevelt made that trade without hesitation. Alternatives FDR chose not to pursue reveal this wasn't an impossible choice with no other options. Geneva Convention protected anyone captured wearing German uniform regardless of actual citizenship, and United States could have stood on that principle and refused forced repatriation. Risk ran that Stalin might retaliate by not releasing American POWs quickly or by treating them roughly, but France proved refusing was possible. France hadn't participated in Yalta Conference, and French commanders in their occupation zones simply refused participating in forced repatriation, and thousands of Soviet refugees made it to French-controlled areas where they got protected. Stalin complained, pressured France, and threatened consequences, but France stood firm and protected refugees anyway. Tiny Liechtenstein, with population of 13,000 people, no army, and 11 policemen told Stalin no when he demanded 500 Russian soldiers who'd taken refuge there, and Prince Franz Joseph II made the decision his nation would not be complicit in sending people to their deaths. If Liechtenstein could stand up to Stalin, if France could refuse forced repatriation, then surely United States with all its military and economic power could have done the same. FDR decided maintaining the Stalin alliance mattered more than protecting refugees from execution, though, that getting American POWs home quickly mattered more than upholding Geneva Convention, and that achieving Soviet cooperation for United Nations in war against Japan mattered more than the lives of 2 million people who weren't American citizens. Numbers tell the story of what that decision cost. More than 2 million people repatriated between 1945 and 1947, an estimated 500 to 750,000 executed either immediately or after brief show trials, 280,000 documented as entering Gulag system where most died within 5 years, and unknown. Additional thousands who died from harsh conditions in special settlements or during transport. Families got systematically destroyed with husbands separated from wives, children taken from parents and raised as children of traitors with new identities, and generations affected by the trauma of what happened. Survivors who eventually got released during Khrushchev thaw of 1950s returned as broken people, sick from years of hard labor, carrying psychological scars that never healed. What we don't know and can never know runs how many people might have escaped repatriation if American and British policy had been different. How many lives could have been saved if FDR had stood on principle and refused Stalin's demands, and whether Stalin would actually have retaliated by refusing to release Western POWs, or whether that threat was a bluff never called. What we do know stands that FDR signed their death warrant on February 11th, 1945, that the deal got made in secret and kept hidden from American public for 3 decades, and that when truth finally emerged through declassified documents, shock and outrage revealed most Americans had no idea this had even happened. 1951 Refugee Convention answered the question, should this ever happen again, with a resounding no by codifying principle of non-refoulement into international law, making it illegal to return people to countries where they face persecution. Modern refugee protection law exists specifically because of Operation Keelhaul, because the world looked at what happened to 2 million people and decided never again would governments be allowed to hand refugees over to their executioners. But for those 2 million people, that protection came too late because they'd already been handed to Stalin under an agreement Franklin Roosevelt had signed. Was it necessary? Could FDR have protected American POWs while also protecting refugees? Or was it truly impossible choice between saving Americans and saving foreigners? Evidence suggests it wasn't impossible, but that FDR decided it wasn't worth the diplomatic cost, wasn't worth risking the Stalin alliance, wasn't worth standing on principle when the people at risk weren't American citizens. France and Liechtenstein proved refusing was possible, but America, under Franklin Roosevelt, chose not to refuse. Verdict of history recorded in international law says what happened was wrong, that forced repatriation violated principles that should have been honored even in 1945, and that the cost of maintaining the Stalin alliance got paid in the lives of 2 million people who trusted Western democracies, would protect them. FDR's deal with Stalin cost them everything, and 80 years later the question remains, was it necessary or was it just convenient? Declassified files provide the answer, and the answer is uncomfortable, alternatives existed but weren't pursued, principles got violated for diplomatic advantage, and 2 million people died because Franklin Delano Roosevelt decided their lives weren't worth the price of standing up to Stalin. That's FDR's legacy from Yalta, the part that doesn't appear in most history textbooks, the secret that stayed buried for 30 years, and the truth that emerges when classified files finally open.